my pleasure today to introduce a talk on poetry, meditation, contemplative education for you all, sponsored by Mosaïque and AIRG. I have a wonderful MA student, Amma, who's going to share Dr. Silverberg's bio with you, and then I'll just talk a little bit more broadly about some of the work that Dr. Silverberg is doing here with us during his sabbatical.
Thank you, Dr. Carter, for the opportunity. So, Mark Silverberg is Professor of English in the Department of Literature, Folklore, and the Arts at Breton University. He is the author of The New York School Poets and the New Avant-Garde, Between Radical Arts and Radical Cheap Ashgate, and the editor of New York School Collaborations, The Color of Vowels, Palgrave and Macmillan. He is also the author of a prize-winning collection of ekphrastic poems, Believing the Line, the Jack Siegel poems, written books, and has published his own poetry widely. His past research has focused on avant-garde American poetry, poetics, interdisciplinary arts, and artistic collaborations. His current work explores Buddhist American poetry, mindfulness, and contemplative practices in education. At McGill, he'll be working with the AIRG group, considering ways in which poetry, meditative practice, and mindful reading can be integrated into university curricula. Thank you.
So for today, the paper that will be shared with us, it traces the historical development of American Buddhism into what religious sociologist Jeff Wilson calls a current mindfulness movement, by considering the important role of American poets in this story. Considering the connections between poetry and meditation, the paper makes some suggestions about how these dual modes of mindfulness might be enlisted in the classroom to further contemplative education. And as I've been told, the Mosaïque kind of dialogues will be recorded and shared widely afterwards. The way that we've decided to kind of set things up, sorry, I keep looking straight into the computer for those on Zoom, but there's also some wonderful people here. So I'm going to share my focus a little bit. But what we're going to do is Dr. Silverberg will talk for about 45 minutes. Then he'll have a chance to sit down, get a glass of water, and I'll come back up and facilitate some questions with everybody who might have some to ask him. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Silverberg. Thank you.
Thank you. This game? I don't know. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Carter. Thank you. Thanks, folks, for being here. Thanks, folks, for being with us on Zoom. I'm joining you at a strange juncture in my career. I'm on sabbatical from Cape Breton University, which for me, this is my second sabbatical, and in both times it kind of produces this weird, uncomfortable freedom. At the same time, I'm moving into a new research area, which is connecting Buddhist studies and contemplative education with my background in literature. I'm also in this liminal space in relation to the academy. To be honest, the deeper I go into Buddhism, and I've spent a lot of my sabbatical in Southeast Asia, on a number of meditation retreats. The further I do that, the more, I don't know, troubled, uncomfortable I am with my relationship to the academy and with, with my approach to the discipline. The more I want to do something different in terms of teaching and in terms of learning. And this is where, this is where my new interests in contemplative education come from. Thinking about ways in which other forms of learning, more non-analytical learning, can be introduced into the classroom and can be introduced into my my projects, my life. So I'm in a kind of exploratory stage. And a lot of those questions have brought me to McGill and brought me to AIRG and brought me here today. So I'm going to give you kind of a wide background about what I've been thinking about. And I'm still figuring out how to make this into something that might be useful for students, that will be useful for me, that will be useful for thinking about what's happened with Buddhism in North America. So a little bit of background. As said, I am, as an academic, an expert in American poetry. Most of my work has been on a group of poets called the New York School Poets. So these are my 2 books on the New York School Poets. These poets were closely associated with the painters and performers and filmmakers of the 1950s and 60s, particularly in New York City at this time. And this is, a really exciting time and place of cultural renaissance in the US. In the poetry world, we've got a lot of extremely influential groups being formed. The New York School Poets, the Beats, the San Francisco Renaissance, the Black Mountain Poets, the Deep Image Poets, etc. This is where we're looking at Donald Allen's famous anthology from the time that introduced a lot of these poets, and it's still kind of a touchstone of the period. In American culture, of course, this is a revolutionary time of protest and exploration and change. The 1950s and 60s was also a time when some very important Buddhist teachers were arriving in the US. So from Tibet, we're seeing on the left here, Chogyam Trungpa, from Japan, Suzuki Roshi, and from Vietnam, Thich Nhat Hanh, maybe the best known of these figures. Thich Nhat Hanh arrived in the US in 1961. These figures, who would have a huge influence on American culture, first had a very significant influence on young artists and poets. That was particularly true given the US involvement in the Vietnam War, which was at its height in the mid-1960s, as was anti-war protest and interest in passive resistance and social justice, and thus Thich Nhat Hanh's ideas about engaged Buddhism struck a particular chord at the time. So in sum, this is kind of, this is a watershed moment for American interest in Asian culture and for the development of American Buddhism, which I'll say more about in a minute. The other important thing to know about my background and kind of how I'm putting together the pieces, still very much putting together the pieces, is that I come to this project not only as a scholar of post-war American poetry, but also as a poet. I've been writing and publishing my own poetry for a long time, and as a long-time meditation practitioner. I discovered Buddhism when I was 18 and first learned to meditate then, and that's been an important part of my life. So my goals for this research are informed by all those identities. First, as an academic, I'm interested in the ways that various poets made Buddhism workable for American poetry. I'm interested in asking questions about how Buddhist texts and practices, teachers and philosophies were turned into poetic resources. Along with those questions, my intuition is that some of the strategies and tools the poets used will also offer pedagogical resources for reading and teaching poetry, and indeed beyond that. The poets were learning more about mindfulness, which they found already resonated with their poetic practices. And as you probably know, that term and concept, mindfulness, has received growing interest in North America over the last few decades. And particularly in terms of university curriculum in forms of what's known as contemplative education. Indeed, it's no coincidence that one of the centers for contemplative education is Naropa University in Colorado, which was the first Buddhist university in the US, founded by Chogyam Trungpa, who we saw before, which also introduced one of the first and most important creative writing programs known as the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics, which was founded by, among others, perhaps the best known poet of the period, Allen Ginsberg. And here we've got Ginsberg and Chogyam Trungpa. Finally, as a teacher and practitioner of meditation and Buddhist thought, I'm interested in the contrast between Sintamayapana, which is Pali for the wisdom from thinking. That is the kind of analytical knowledge that tends to be most valued in universities, at least North American universities, and Bhavana Mayapana, wisdom from practice. Wisdom from practice is also a kind of poetic knowledge that comes from experience. It's the craft person's deep understanding of their craft. It's knowledge that could be written down and explained, but could never be fully transmitted that way. And this is exactly the kind of knowledge that the poets were finding both in meditation and in poetry. So part of my experience in this realm has come from years of meditation practice, of learning what can be gained by sitting and walking silently, watching the mind. And especially this has come from retreat practice, which I mentioned earlier. I've been doing, had a chance to do quite a lot of in the past year. And those are times when, everything, daily habits and schedules and electronics and words and food are put away, so that all of one's time during the day or longer is dedicated to meditation practice. Those who have done this know the pleasure and difficulty of such practice and the wisdom that can't be transmitted any other way but by experiencing it. The Buddha had a single word for this, ehipassiko, which can be translated as come and see for yourself or verify for yourself. Don't, in other words, you don't take my word for it. Don't take the words of the teachers and books. You have to experience this yourself. And this is, this is like, that seems like a central concept to me about how and what I'd like to figure out ways of offering that to students. So poetry, and no doubt art in general, offers a similar kind of experiential wisdom that we experience for ourselves. And I think that's why, poetry readers sort of form this unique cohort. They feel like they understand one another and understand something. It's also maybe why a surprising number of American poets also became Zen priests or monastics. Here's a couple of examples. And we'll look at some of their words coming up. So the other thing that I want to emphasize, and this became particularly clear living in Thailand for a number of months, is that this project is about American Buddhism, which is quite different from Asian Buddhism. So let me say a few words about what American Buddhism is. Anthropologists use the term indigenization to refer to the transformations that occur within an important cultural system, changes that enable it to better fit local customs. It's important to understand that Buddhism is not a monolithic religion. It began with the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama. This is the original Buddha in India 2,600 years ago, but then traveled and adapted, indigenized in many Asian contexts. So Japanese Zen Buddhism is quite different from Chinese Buddhism, which is different from Thai and Burmese and Vietnamese Buddhism, etc. American Buddhism is best seen through the same lens. Its practices are adaptations of the original teachings and texts in culturally specific forms that speak to Americans. This form of Buddhism has been developing since the early 20th century, but definitely, had its greatest period of growth in the 1950s, in no small part because of the writers who, who come out of Naropa and come out of these traditions, the writers who I'm looking at and studying. American Buddhism tends to be pragmatic, philosophical, and aesthetic rather than religious. since it developed in a culture that already had a strong dominant, that is Christian religious orientation, that had infiltrated culture on all levels. American Buddhism tends to be secular and meditation-based rather than religious and devotion-based, the way that Asian Buddhisms often tend to be. Indeed, the more I look at the issue, the more I tend to agree with religious studies scholar Jeff Wilson, whose book Mindful America talks about a mindfulness movement rather than American Buddhism. As noted, to a great extent, the movement is secular and often found outside of religious contexts. North Americans tend to have meditation centers rather than temples. And perhaps the mindfulness movement's most predominant form, that is John Kabat-Zinn's MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, is found in hospitals and health centers. MBSR is now a fixture of the skyrocketing growth industry of wellness, along with other popular and lucrative cultural adaptations. Mindful eating, mindful parenting, mindful business leadership, etc., that have become quite familiar to North Americans. Much has already been written about the problems with the commodification of Buddhism in North America, in forms of what critic Ronald Purser famously called McMindfulness. He writes in Beyond McMindfulness, uncoupling mindfulness from its ethical and religious Buddhist context is understandable as an expedient move to make such training a viable product on the open market. But in the rush to secularize and commodify mindfulness into a marketable technique may be leading to an unfortunate denaturing of this ancient practice, which was intended for more than relieving a headache, reducing blood pressure, and helping executives become better focused and more productive. Using poetry as a focus for understanding American Buddhism is a way, I believe, to avoid some of the pitfalls of McMindfulness, since what the poets were making and selling is far from a marketable product. Indeed, part of poetry's value may be its very uselessness, the same kind of non-purposive value that one can also find in meditation. That is when it's not instrumentalized in the ways that it sometimes can be in MBSR, etc. So I want to spend a little time considering what American poets found in Buddhism and in meditation practice. It seems to me, as a scholar and a practitioner, that these two activities have a lot in common, though that might not be so obvious at first, except to the poets, who we will kind of follow to get some of these ideas. So some of my ideas on the topic then come directly from the poet's words. This is from the proceedings. What we're looking at here is the proceedings from a 1987 conference at Green Gulch Farm Zen Center in California, where poet Norman Fisher, who we saw before, was also the priest. This was the first conference. The conference was called The Poetics of Emptiness, a collaborative gathering of poets who meditate. Included over 30 poets and an audience of up to 300 people. Here, this little conference proceedings I discovered when I was at Naropa. One of the participants, Andrew Schelling, had a copy of this, so I was able to borrow it and go through some of it. So what do the poets suggest about the relationship between these two occupations? Here are Norman Fisher's opening words. I've been doing Zazen for almost 20 years, and I've been writing for longer than that. But until I began doing Zazen, I couldn't get the feel of writing. When I finally did get the feel of it, inevitably, that feel had everything to do with Zazen. I had to have a way of writing that put me into the world rather than out of it, looking at it and describing it. Both poets and meditators use the word practice regularly to describe what would seem to some the unusual pastime they engage in. Andrew Schelling notes both poetry and meditation demand hard work. but work which accepts uselessness as its principal term. Schelling intends uselessness to have a positive valence. This is work which is non-instrumental, completed without desire for pragmatic gain. It is work outside of the workaday world of production and consumption. This is also the kind of work that Jenny Odell explores in her recent important book, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy. Zazen, the Japanese form of just sitting, might be seen in a sense as a response to the compulsion towards productivity in what Odell calls the blasted landscape of neoliberal determinism. Here's a meme that kind of well embodies this position. Don't just do something, sit there. The imperative to sit there is a call to non-commercial presence. Meditation is, in this sense, a non-activity whose goal is to not change things around us, to accept and dwell in what is. Poet, translator, environmentalist Gary Snyder says, meditation is the art of deliberately staying open so that myriad things can experience themselves. One of the ways that phenomena experience themselves is in poetry. In Snyder's model for poetry, which is a Zen model whose ideal embodiment is the three-line haiku that does nothing but observe what is, the practice is also improvisational. The poet or poem enters the mind or enters the world without preconceived plan or goal, without the intention of commodifying or doing something, but instead with the attention to attend to moment experience. Poet Gail Shear describes something similar. I want to say that the idea of emptying one's consciousness is the same as emptying language. If anything's left, it's like the fishes in the pond. The pond is predominant. I want to write from such a place as this so that everyone understands their pond mind. Using language as language rather than as a vehicle for something else is the way I have found. Using language as language means foregrounding sound, tone, rhythm, affect, rather than denotative meaning. That is the currency by which real work, that is commercial, saleable work, gets done. Prose, in a way, right? Prose versus poetry. The work of pond mind, on the other hand, is usually improvisational, experimental, and non-purposive. It's not trying to tell us something or sell us anything, but instead allows what arises from language, like those strange fish that might float up from the bottom of the pond or the bottom of the mind. Many spiritual traditions talk about a similar process as one of surrendering, not necessarily to a higher power as theistic religious traditions might frame it, but rather surrendering to what is happening, to reality. That process, again, will be familiar to meditators who understand that the practice is not about doing something like trying to calm your mind, but rather about developing the patience to sit, to rest with whatever is present. Here's Norman Fisher talking about what happens both in writing and in sitting meditation. The grip on self can naturally loosen. The grip on meaning loosens, and there is the possibility of entering wholeheartedly into a dark and unknown territory. I suspect that we're entering an area that can only be adequately comprehended with experience, that is, Bhavavan, Mayapana. And that this is the connection where contemplative education practices come in. Studying this poetry seems to me to require a taste of the kind of knowledge or experience the poets or meditators are talking about. And that knowledge is best generated not just by analyzing poems, but by engaging in some of the contemplative practices like the ones outlined in this slide, whether those are creative or relational or movement-based or meditation-based. These practices are likewise an opportunity to guide students away from pragmatic, analytical, banking models of education, which in its ranking and grading reinforces a kind of deterministic neoliberal attention reinforced by what Odell calls the attention economy, and instead open a different kind of door. So, next, I wanted to offer you kind of a short journey in this direction, along with one more poet, who I haven't talked about yet, one who's kind of been pulling me particularly in this direction in the past year. This is Jane Hirshfield. Hirshfield was born in 1953 in New York City, but spent a great deal of her adult life in California, where she moved in the late 1960s, spending 8 years training in Zen Buddhism at the San Francisco Zen Center. That was founded by Suzuki Roshi, and then living as a monastic at the Tassajara Zen Mountain Center. Since leaving the monastery, she's published 10 volumes of poetry, several volumes of essays and translations, and won multiple awards, held various teaching posts, etc. Asked in an interview about the connection between poetry and meditation practice, Hirshfield said, "I think of these two things as a left foot and a right foot. It's the same activity, but it's not the same foot. It's the same intention of awareness," the key term, of getting under our own easy preconceptions. Meditation and poetry writing both require dropping out of the conventional clutter, the conventional chatter, the superficial dialogue that we're always having in our brains with the world and with our ego, into a different layer, which is less busy and a great deal more receptive. Left foot and right foot are references to walking meditation, a less familiar but important form of mindfulness, one part of which is being aware of the conventional chatter and letting it go, to see what the world might look like when our perceptions are not dominated by ego. Poetry is the perfect medium for this kind of contemplation because I think it's the one that most closely and purely mimics awareness. Its form is the malleable shape of awareness itself. It doesn't call for plot arc, character development, the necessity of tension or conflict. Instead, it presents a blank canvas shaped like the mind, which will be inscribed as the mind is with words and images. So I'm going to conclude the talk in a bit. I'm going to conclude, but not yet, by reading one Hirshfield poem together, which I think well represents what I'll call her poetics of mindfulness, a poetics that enacts the shaping of language that she's been talking about and Shear's talking about, etc. But before we do that, I want to prepare the ground a little by offering a short meditation to allow us a few minutes of working with our minds in a different way than the way we're typically used to when we sit and listen to papers. So some of you may have experience with meditation, some of you may have a lot of experience, some of you may have no experience at all. It doesn't matter. Experienced meditators know that a key place to arrive at meditation is what Suzuki Roshi calls beginner's mind. That is beginning each experience freshly to see what's there. All right, so let's clear a space for ourselves, whether you're here or whether you're on Zoom. You want to literally and figuratively and literally clear a space to shift your mind into a slightly different mode. So it helps to work with our bodies first to do that. So I would invite you to put down anything you're holding, plant your 2 feet on the ground. If you're in a chair leaning back, it's a good idea to move forward in your chair. That's going to allow you to adopt the most important thing about a meditative position. There are lots of different meditative positions, but it's that we're relaxed but alert. So that's the thing to think about. So you might want to rest your hands on your knees or rest your hands somewhere comfortable. And then your spine is upright. That's the alertness. You might imagine kind of, the puppet string pulling your head up to have that alert spine. And at this point, if you're comfortable doing so, you can close your eyes. Or if you're not comfortable with that, you can just lower your gaze. And we're pausing. The pause is really everything. The pause is the space that the poets and meditators are talking about. It's a space where we can ask ourselves, what's here? And where we can be receptive to what we haven't noticed that's here, and be receptive to what might come next. One method that I practice called insight dialogue calls this attuning to emergence. That is seeing what might be next. One thing that might emerge as we sit here quietly is the way your body is at the present moment. This thing that we carry that's with us all the time, like our breath, but which is really easy to ignore most of the time. So take a minute to scan your body and look for tightness or holding. What's going on inside? And then can you relax those parts a little? That's the next important part of pausing. And pausing itself, I think, is, pausing leads to the ability to relax. So we're looking at what can be let go of a little inside. You might relax your shoulders, feel their weight, the muscles in your face. Soften your hands. Then you might pause to notice the aliveness in your hands. That sensation of energy, tingling, all of the life going on in your hands. You might notice that the more we relax, the more we feel. You might notice the chair or the cushion underneath you, your sitting bones in contact with the chair, the feeling of gravity subtly pulling you down. Your feet are planted on the ground, in contact with the ground, in contact with the earth, and everything else that's touching the earth right now. And now, become aware of your breath. Might want to take a few deep breaths. Deep inhale and exhale. And then just let your breath return to normal. No need to exaggerate it. No need to work or to do anything really. The body breathes all by itself. Your only job now is just to notice the in-breath and the out-breath. Might help to pay attention to the breath by thinking about the chest and belly, noticing the belly gently rising and falling. Or the breath might be more apparent to you at the nostrils. You might notice it there, and you might imagine air at the tip of your nose coming in and out. So pay attention to one of those two areas, whichever seems more vivid to you. Doesn't matter which. Just choose one. And now we're just going to spend a moment following the breath, following the inflow and the outflow. We could use this phrase by Thich Nhat Hanh. Breathing in, I know I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I know I'm breathing out. Take a minute to just follow. And as you're doing that, you're likely to notice, perhaps you've noticed all along, that your mind is doing other stuff besides following your breath and listening to me. It's probably producing thoughts, maybe thoughts about the past or about the future, about what's going to happen after this meditation is over, what's going to happen after this talk is over, why am I doing this? And that's all right. That's what minds are meant to do, produce thoughts. Practice of meditation isn't about trying to stop thoughts, but just to become aware of them. And following the breath is asking you to follow the breath rather than follow the thought, not to get lost in the thought. So when a thought arises, you can simply recognize it. This is the technique of mindfulness of breathing. Recognize, oh, here's a thought. And then gently, without judgment, bringing your mind back to the breath. And then likely a minute later, there'll be another thought. And that's fine. Just recognize it again. You might label it. It might help to say thinking, and then drop it and go back to the breath. So let's do this for just 1 minute. Following the breath, labeling thinking, returning to the breath. Okay. Let's come back. If this was a class, or if we had time, we'd have time to talk about the experience a little, or just take questions or observations. And that, when I'm teaching poetry, particularly if I'm teaching poetry like this, that's extremely useful because it gives people an actual experiential basis for understanding and talking about what the poets are writing about. But since we're not doing that here, I will at the end of the talk invite questions and would love to hear observations about that experience. I wanted to provide that experience as a way of moving into reading of one poem by Jane Hirshfield, which, as I said, I think I hope brings some of this together. The poem we're going to look at is called My Skeleton, which is a provocative and appropriately Buddhist subject, I think, since the skeleton is both self and non-self, a deep inner core, which is at the same time lifeless bone and animating force. It's worth noting too that in some Buddhist traditions, monks meditate with corpses, perhaps as a reminder of the famous Buddhist 5 remembrances, the first 3 of which are, I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape having ill health. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. So let's sit with those for a minute. In some ways, then I think Hirshfield is going to use the skeleton as well, it directs us to a lot of questions. Some of those questions I think are provoked by those remembrances. So let me read you her poem. My skeleton. My skeleton, who once ached with your own growing larger, are now each year imperceptibly smaller, lighter, absorbed by your own concentration. When I danced, you danced. When you broke, I. And so it was lying down, walking, climbing the tiring stairs, your jaws, my bread. Someday you, what is left of you, will be flensed of this marriage, angular wrist bones arthritis, cracked harp of rib cage, blunt of heel, open bowl of skull, twin platters of pelvis. Each of you will leave me behind, serene, leave me behind at last, serene. What did I know of your days, your nights? I who held you all my life inside my hands and thought they were empty. You who held me all your life in your hands, as a new mother holds her own unblanketed child, not thinking at all. The poem is an act of contemplation or meditation, but on what, we might ask? Interiority, maybe? The other self? The self below the self? Embodiment in its densest skeletal form? Or maybe it's on its opposite, insubstantiality, transitoriness, impermanence. These are all key Buddhist terms. Anicca is a Buddhist term for impermanence, one of the 3 key ideas, really, of the Buddhas. Like so many of Hirshfield's poems, it brings a close attention to what is so near us that it's easy to overlook altogether. Our skeletons, like our breath, which of course is what we were meditating on, one of the key meditation foci is the breath. These are things that are essential and in daily life ignorable, there and not there. Hirshfield's poems often act as Zen koans or puzzles of a kind, ones without simple answers that direct readers to important Buddhist philosophical concepts. That our hands are both empty and not empty is an image for the Buddhist concept of emptiness, or sunyata in Sanskrit, which teaches that nothing can be completely independent, can have a completely independent or separate existence. Here's an explanation of Sunyata from Thich Nhat Hanh, who I find to be probably the most comprehensible of the explicators of these sometimes tricky philosophical concepts. So Thich Nhat Hanh says, emptiness is the middle way. And again, hands empty and not empty. The skeleton tells us that. Emptiness is the middle way between existent and non-existent. The beautiful flower does not become empty when it fades and dies. It is already empty in its essence. Looking deeply, we see that the flower is made of non-flower elements, light, space, clouds, earth, and consciousness. It is empty of a separate, independent self. And our hands and ourselves, this poem is maybe suggesting, are the same. I want to suggest that the poem offers the opportunity for this kind of contemplation, and indeed the contemplation of numerous other Buddhist concepts, without kind of forcing them on us. It does this by presenting a mind in the process or practice of thinking. My skeleton is, in fact, one among dozens of Hirshfield's My poems. She has ones called My Species, My Proteins, My Doubt, My Contentment, My Hunger, My Dignity, and ending in her second last book, Ledger, with a poem called My Silence, which is a Cajun 4 minutes and 22 seconds of blank page. We're just faced with a blank page called My Silence. These My poems are all reflections on the problem, or from the Buddhist perspective, the delusion of self. This is the second of the key Buddhist doctrines, anatta, or no self. Here's Hirshfield elaborating on this in an interview. Where does the self begin and end? Is my skeleton me? Am I it? And what do we do about the fact that selves aren't terribly stable or definable things, because they are, in the end, inseparable from everything? Here, Hirshfield is pointing to another key Buddhist concept of interconnectedness, what Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing. We depend on food, water, air, other people. There's nothing about us that didn't come from the world and won't return from the world. We can't survive independently. We are interdependent. For example, depending on our skeletons, which we didn't make, but just received as a gift of birth. Again, our skeletons are both us and not us, a duality, which is not a duality. Your jaws, my bread. Well, the poem is a dialogue between two selves. It also calls self into question. Is my skeleton, or are my proteins, or is my hunger or my doubt really mine? In what sense do they belong or not belong to me? One last observation is that while my skeleton may feel like a very kind of thinky, mind-based, awareness-focused poem, at least when it's paired with my thinking about it, and I recognize that, that's what we have to do in talks, is unpack, offer our thinking to someone, to listeners, rather than inviting listeners to co-think with us. Anyway, well, it might seem like, it seems like a thinky poem. It's also a poem about embodiment, about what it means to have a body. I find in reading it, this kind of thick, rich language reminds us of that. The angular wrist bones arthritis, cracked harp of rib cage, blunt of heel, twin platters of pelvis. It's a poem about touch and sensation, but it's also a poem about how much we don't see, how much will disappear when we are flensed of this marriage, i.e. when we arrive at the place that we will all arrive at in the third Buddhist remembrance about death. So let's just reread the conclusion. What did I know of your days, your nights? I who held you all my life inside my hands and thought they were empty. You who held me all your life in your hands as a new mother holds her own unblanketed child, not thinking at all. I noticed the way that Hirshfield plays with duality, non-duality through structure. I who held you, you who held me. And then the conclusion, which turns from holding to emptiness, from the said to the unsaid, as a new mother holds her own unblanketed child, not thinking at all. We move from the flesh-flensed otherness of the skeleton, we might think cold, dead, though in this poem also totally animate and alive. It's chewing, walking, climbing. We move from that to the intimate image of the mother and the unblanketed child. Where we wind up is with the unsaid and the unthought, not thinking at all. Words that bring an end to words, and in that way might also remind us of meditation, and indeed might bring us into a meditative state. That's certainly one of the things that I love about reading Hirshfield is like her poems are like a natural meditation app. I tend to read them at night because that's the time when my mind is primed for this. These words and the pause they enact remind us of how significant the silences in our lives can be. It's this kind of silence, an antidote to the attention economy that Odell talks about, that I believe contemplative practices can offer students. Thank you.